All right, welcome everyone to this event. We are glad that you could join us for this summer presentation. Um, I want to let you know that we appreciate each one of you who are our members for your support and your encouragement. We want to encourage those attendees who are not members to become members, and you can do that by going to our web page and finding the information there to become a member. And finally, we'd like to encourage you to support FDC's social media presence. We have a number of places that we are. We're on Facebook, where you can post, like, comment, and share. That would be appreciated. We have a YouTube channel and Rumble channels. You can hit the subscribe button, and let us know that you're supporting us there. Also, listen to FDC's podcasts on Substack and Spotify. And lastly, subscribe to our Substack for bi-monthly posts. There's lots for you to take advantage of. Hopefully, it'll be helpful to you in your own efforts to be informed and to serve the wider conservative community, your neighborhood, your friends, family. At this time, I want to explain a little bit about Zoom etiquette for this event. In order to create an atmosphere of respect, what we would ask is that you keep your mics muted during the presentation. And after the presentation, there'll be a question and answer period, which Perry will deal with. But then you'll have an opportunity to type your questions, and we'll do it through Perry first. We'll get a chance to ask Stephen our questions. And then if there's time permitting later, we'll go to an open mic. But we'll just see how the evening unfolds that way. So Perry will explain Q&A details later on after Stephen has presented. So with that being said, I would like to introduce our guest for tonight. This is Stephen Reich, and a couple of things about him. Stephen is a former lawyer and is currently a PhD student. His upcoming doctoral research will examine the ideological underpinnings of teacher training in Ontario and whether it is designed to prepare teachers for the reality of classroom teaching. Stephen is also a co-chair of University of Toronto's Heterodox Academy and a member of the organization's national executive. Apart from his work in educational policy, Stephen has a number of other talents and abilities. He's a former actor and a current choral director, vocalist, and musical arranger. So if you're looking for someone for a wedding or a party, no, I'm just kidding. We'll see what kind of reaction Stephen gets out of that. We'll see. Tonight, Stephen will be addressing the ideological battleground between parents and the state that public education has become. His focus will be on the current state of public education in Canada, how we got here, and maybe a little more importantly for us, what we can do about it, because we need to have a plan of action. So with that being said, Stephen, we want to welcome you. We're glad you can join us. If there's anything else that's apropos to our getting to know you, please feel free, but the floor is yours, Stephen.
Thank you. Yeah, let's get started. And I'm going to just run you a little bit through some of the ideas in terms of my research, some of my findings, and then I'm going to turn it over to you to address any of the specific questions that you have. So this is going to be a bit more general, and then you can ask specific questions. Okay. Can you just allow me to share my screen?
Yeah, we're going to do that right now for you, Stephen. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So he's a co-host. Okay.
Great.
Should be able to do it now.
Yeah, I can. Great. Okay. Go.
Okay.
Yeah. Suck. All right. So let's take a look at this. How well did 15-year-old students in Canada do on the PISA test? And we can see here that this is between 2003 and 2022. Mathematics, reading, and science, not very encouraging. Here's the rest of the OECD countries. And one should keep in mind that this is even with countries that haven't experienced this kind of decline, like Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, and even still, you see these precipitous declines. I mean, it's even by 2003 declining in most of them. Reading is a bit of an exception. But then around 2012, 2015, you see a real precipitous decline. Now, one thing you'll often see is in Canada, the media will say, well, we're doing the same. We have nothing to worry about. We're doing the same as the other OECD countries. But when you take a look at what the other OECD countries are doing, then we see the problem. And where this comes from is the fact that all of these countries have adopted the same paradigm. By paradigm, I mean sort of view of education in terms of its purpose and then how it's, what its content is and what is delivered. Something that originated in the United States, which was never known for its fantastic public education system in general. And we see the predictable results that we followed in their footsteps. So let's get started and take a look at these paradigms. So the first one that we're going to talk about that guides public education is rationalism. And this was kind of what took hold in Canada up until the mid to late 1970s. Rationalism is also known by other terms such as traditionalism. You might hear a classical liberal curriculum. But when I'm talking about these paradigms, I'm talking both about the curriculum, the what you're teaching, and the pedagogy, how you're teaching. So under rationalism, you're talking about the teacher as the focus of the classroom, as the expert in the room who knows his or her subject matter that is being conveyed to the students in ways that help the students learn. And the role of the teacher is really to get the students to mastery, and if not mastery, at least to fluency. So here, if you look at my diagram on the left, we have the dependent child. They're subjected in public schooling to expert training in knowledge. So that's your history of knowledge, the skills that go along with those areas of knowledge, the attitudes and behaviors that are necessary for learning. And this is all the teacher's responsibility. And the subject matters are reading, writing, mathematics, history, social studies, geography, etc., etc. The teacher has to ensure that all the students are learning in tandem. It's whole classroom instruction. There's no assumption that parents are going to be running a homeschool after hours. It's the teacher's responsibility. There's frequent testing to make sure that the children are actually learning what they're being taught. And then it's applied in new ways. The curriculum is not broad. The curriculum in these areas is pretty restricted. So you'll see in grade 1, maybe you learn addition and subtraction in math. In grade 2, you might review that. You might start a little bit with multiplication. Grade 3, you're doing multiplication. Grade 4, you're doing division. Grade 5 is when you introduce algebra. You don't introduce it before the children have mastered the skills leading up to it. So then what is the ultimate result and the purpose of the education? It's so that, and when I talk about each of these paradigms, I'm going to talk about it on a personal level and then on a societal level. So on a personal level, this rationalist educational model is supposed to result in an independent adult with civilizational knowledge. And by civilizational knowledge, I mean, the big compendium of knowledge that human history has accumulated to date and no further, because we can't predict the future. So anything that's talking about jobs of the 21st or 22nd century or critical thinking skills, that is not a rationalist curriculum, because of course, we don't know that. As an example, 5 years ago, everyone was saying, oh, we've got to start computer coding in grade 1. That's the job of the future. And now we find ourselves that coding is now taken over by AI and there are no jobs in coding. So, that's, again, what we're doing is we're educating students for everything that we know to now. And then they go forth in their adult life. They decide on what career, what job they're going to do, what more they're going to learn. And that's really left up to them. Societally, we want to instill a sense of duty and responsibility to fellow citizens, to the nation. So feeling a sense of being Canadian is very important when we're talking about this country. So that's rationalism. So rationalism gave way around the 1970s. It starts, but it really peaked in the 2000s to progressivism. So progressivism has a whole different view. Progressivism looks at every child as a genius, that if released from the bonds of civilization, that they will trample, they will run through the fields, and they'll be creative and motivated, and they're going to create their own knowledge, and they're going to work together cooperatively with other children. All we have to do in terms of being a teacher, and this is the second picture underneath, is free the child. We have to get rid of all the oppressive constraints on children so that they'll be creative. And what about stuff like reading and writing and math and geography? Well, that's less important. I mean, a teacher can kind of inject that in while the kids are doing their projects or their play or whatever, but it's not necessary, and it's kind of loosey goosey, which means that this style of education benefits the middle and upper classes whose parents actually worry about whether or not their children are reading and writing, and then who either hire tutors or they're running homeschool after school in order to get their kids to do it. But at school, the kids are learning pretty much nothing other than, the ones who are extremely motivated, perhaps extremely smart, they'll be fine. The poor kids you can forget about. They're going to, construct their own knowledge all the way to a learning disability. And so, what is the purpose of that? Well, on the personal realm, it's all about self-esteem, that we want children to feel good about themselves, that they are good people. And societally, that we've decided that in under progressivism, that the goal of education is so that you become a lifelong problem solver, that all the problems in your life you're able to solve because in your, once you've been unleashed from the constraints of this society, that you will naturally be solving your own problems and solving the problems of others in cooperation with them. So this began to give way in the 2000s, and it really went big in 2015, and then went over the top in 2020 with the George Floyd incidents in the States with criticalism. Now, the academic underpinnings of all of these movements predate when I'm talking about them entering the classroom, but really, you start seeing it in the curriculum, in the pedagogy around the 2000s, and then it goes really big. So, what are we starting with? We're starting with that every child has a group identity, and that group identity is either oppressed or oppressor. And basically, if you have European heritage, if you're male, if you're straight, there's sort of rules that have to do with this. Has nothing to do with whether or not you grew up in foster care, whether or not you come from a two-parent family, whether or not your family had any money or resources. Nothing to do with that. It has to do, are you white or are you of color? Are you straight or are you gay? Are you, and now the latest one is, do you just have your sex, or now do you have a gender identity that's separate from your sex? So what is the purpose of the teacher? The purpose of the teacher is to help the students free themselves from oppression. And they do that by really emphasizing your group identity is oppressed, and whatever, and it doesn't matter what subject matter they're talking about. You always do it through the lens of look how oppressed these marginalized groups are, and it's unfair, and therefore we basically have to have a revolution, and we have to remake society. So even though you don't know anything about society, you haven't learned anything, you haven't learned anything about experts in the past and the problems that they confronted and how that turned out, for example. We let children at it, and whatever their youth culture is that they bring into the classroom, they should be free to do it. So if their youth culture is kind of to do with gangs, if it's anti-academic, if it's anti-study, if it's antisocial, that's fine. Like we're going to use that. We're going to use that so that the children really focus on their own oppression. And so, what is the result of that? Well, on a personal level, we want to make sure that everyone is has an identity around their mental health. And when I say mental health, I'm not talking about that we want to make sure that everyone is mentally healthy. To the contrary, we want to make sure that everyone is focused on their mental health and that they have little to no resilience. so that anything that punctures that, whether it be a personal failure, not getting a good mark, getting bullied, having someone say something mean to you, that affects your mental health, because any oppression gives you power. And societally, we're going to overthrow society and create some sort of socialist utopia. But in any of the academic writing by educationists, you won't find, what that's going to look like, how it's going to come about, what we can expect from it. You're just supposed to sign on to it in general. Now, what about, reading, writing, math, geography, or whatever? Well, those aren't considered important. Those are considered matters of whiteness and Eurocentrism. We idealize the way that non-European societies live, not actually how they lived historically, but rather we've created myths around them. Like, it's sort of in itself, it's racist. It's this idea of the noble savage, and so we elevate that. And whether children learn anything else is not really important. But of course, to the parents, then of course the parents are stuck in the position of that they have to run a homeschool or send their kids to tutoring. So the tutoring industrial complex has gone nuts since the 2000s, because the schools can't, in a 7-hour day, 5 days a week, accomplish teaching children knowledge. So when I'm talking about teaching, there's two aspects to it. There's the curriculum and pedagogy. So curriculum is the responsibility of the provincial Ministry of Education, and so every province will have it. But generally, the curriculum in every province is mostly the same. And the reason it's mostly the same is because we're basically copying what the Americans are doing, and we always have. So whatever the trends are in the States, we'll copy them, and we'll erase the Canadian context. We'll just adopt them, and then they become so. When they in the States came out with, mathematics is so boring, you have to memorize your multiplication tables. Let's have new math where you color and you discover patterns or whatever. Well, then Canada just adopts it. Now, does it actually help children learn math? Is it going to help them doing algebra or geometry? Well, that's irrelevant, because we don't want to test it, because testing, of course, would harm children's mental health. So we have no way of knowing whether or not these things help. So that's really the responsibility of the provincial Ministry of Education. You have an issue with the curriculum, you go to your Minister of Education. That's the person responsible. So now we move over to pedagogy. And here I've got two pictures. On the left is a picture that is more rationalist. It's the idea that the front of the classroom is the focus. The teacher is delivering a lesson with active student participation, but there's nothing distracting the students. The teacher is the focus. The students may be coming up to the board to do their work. The teacher is constantly monitoring their work, etc. And then we contrast that with a progressive, and in this case, perhaps even a criticalist classroom, overly decorated. We wonder why kids have ADHD, if there is such a thing as ADHD or attention deficit swell. I mean, you tell me how much, a 6 or 7-year-old is going to concentrate in a room that's decorated like this. Why would you look at a boring teacher when you can be looking at all that paper mache and rainbows and diagrams and all the other stuff that's there? So whose responsibility is the pedagogy? Again, the Provincial Ministry of Education, as well as faculties of education at our universities. And those, both of those are influenced by the College of Teachers, who usually will, in most provinces, will be the one to certify the teachers as being able to now teach, and the teachers' unions. So generally, you will find that the paradigm that is being followed, whether we're talking about rationalist, progressivist, or criticalist, these are all they're not in conflict with each other. The Provincial Ministry of Education is in cahoots with the teachers' unions and the College of Teachers, the faculties of education. They're all on the same page. They may argue about budget, but the fact of the matter is they're all on the same page. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. So I looked at, and I'm using Ontario as an example, all of the ministry documents that were available online. I started this research during the pandemic. Between 1982 and 2022, nearly 700 policy documents covering everything from curriculum, pedagogy, budgeting documents, etc. But generally, the findings that I'm going to show you exclude those budgeting documents, and that I'm only dealing with documents that would affect children in the classroom and the teacher in the classroom. So that would be the curriculum and pedagogy. So if you look, obviously, from the graph, 1982 to 1986, I did in 5-year time periods because, of course, every year ministry is not producing new curriculum or new policy documents. But in a 5-year period, we can sort of say, well, let's compare, 4 or 5-year periods and see how that looks. And you can see in 1997, this whole thing with critical theory, which, other people, will call woke. That's where it first makes its appearance, and then it grows in the 2000s. And Ontario, it crests in 2016, and it lowers very slightly in 2017, but that's because there was a real push to bring out new curriculum in 2012 to 2016, and less so in 2017 to 2022. But as you can see, there's astronomical growth. In fact, in terms of those critical terms like identity, anti-Black racism, discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, etc., those kinds of words, any of the pedagogy directed toward them, project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, discovery learning. There's been a 1,730% increase in criticalist language since 1997. All right, so now let's compare that to rationalist pedagogy terms. And by that I mean what we've been talking about, what you would normally think of as the tools that a teacher would have to have. So, here we're talking not just traditionally about how teachers teach, but there's now a whole body of learning science, which has been going on since the 1950s, which is testing sort of our common sense notions of what is a teacher, what is a teacher doing. And in fact has mostly validated what had been done for hundreds of years, but has actually gone in and said, but here we're going to be even more specific about here's methods that are going to work for everyone. It doesn't matter your socioeconomic level, it doesn't matter whether you come from a home with lots of resources or not, it doesn't matter if your parents read to you or not. These are things that work in any classroom if you follow. So we see that this was never popular during this period of time. If one were able to go back and look at maybe the 1940s and the 1950s, we would see we wouldn't see any criticalist terms, but we would see a lot more terminology that would align with things like phonics, phonemic awareness, multiplication, learning your multiplication tables, learning geography, direct instruction from the teacher, those kinds of terminologies. So we see even in 2002 to 2006, minimal rationalist pedagogy terms. Progressivism had already taken over, as I said previously. And then, boop, in 2007 to 2011, we see the first appearance of criticalist terms in pedagogy and curriculum documents of ministry. And now let's look at the next 4-year period or 5-year period, 2012 to 2016. And you can see that it just zooms. By 2017 to 2022, the rationalist pedagogy terms have completely disappeared from the curriculum. They're gone. All we have left is criticalism. So what are we seeing? When we look at this, a 94% decrease in learning science terms. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of rationalist. A 228% increase in critical pedagogy terms. A 2,060% more critical pedagogy terms than rationalist pedagogy terms over this 20-year span of ministry policy. And I would surmise that the same would be true in every province. All right, so let's dig in a little bit deeper. Let's talk about the reading wars, the elementary school language curriculum, how to teach children to read and write. Ontario had an old curriculum, 2006, And the Human Rights Commission came out with a report called the Right to Read Report and basically slapped everyone from the ministry down to the faculties of education, to the teachers' unions, to the Ontario College of Teachers, and said, you've embraced these progressivist methods, and now you've embraced this criticalism where your concerns are all about socio-cultural matters that have very little to do with education, and we're failing our children. And some of those statistics were just frightening. Like 40% of the graduating workforce in Canada is functionally illiterate, meaning that they cannot read and write at the grade 10 level. 30% of students in grades 3, grade 6, and grade 9 are also unable to read. And in Ontario, we have testing where the teachers are actually allowed to read the question on the test to the student and then write the answer for it. So that includes them. So if we were to take that out, you can only imagine what the level would be. Plus, students can be excused if you have an IEP, an independent educational program, because you've been designated as learning disabled, and most learning disabilities are dyslexia, which mostly doesn't exist. They even cite the fact that if you use proper reading and spelling and writing methods, that 95 to 98% of children will learn to read. We're talking about a tiny percentage. So when we've got over 30% of children unable to do so, that's a big problem. And so the Human Rights Commission said, focus on rationalist, what the learning science is, not criticalist methods. So what did the government do? All right. So we see in 2006, there was about equal criticalist and rationalist terminology in the curriculum. And so they were admonished by the Human Rights Commission. And what happens when they come out with their new curriculum? Also about equal. In fact, a little bit more critical theory language, like the woke language, the sociocultural concerns. But basically, just this giant increase. They've just stuffed the curriculum full of it. So we see between these 2 years, an over 2,000% increase in the use of criticalist terms, or the criticalist term identity, because that's the big one for critical theory, right? We want to build children's identities as either oppressed or oppressor. So that's their big concern. A 2,000% increase of a term that was unknown in educational circles before this. A 243% increase in the use of DEI terms. So we know we're talking about equity, diversity, inclusion. Again, what this has to do with reading, I don't know. I don't know what it has to do with spelling or literature. There's certainly no studies saying that any of these things help. In fact, the studies say the opposite. We know how to get children reading. We're just not doing it. The government has made their decision. All right, Math Wars. Elementary school math curriculum, 2005 to 2020. So we can see here that there was a little bit of criticalism in the 2005 math curriculum. That was a fad that was taking on, and more than double the amount in terms of rationalism. So while they still were not by this point in favor of children memorizing anything or having to practice anything, it was a little bit there. And then what happens? They revised the curriculum on the guidance of experts, and the criticalism terms increased by 815%. Now, there is an increase in rationalist terms, but in comparison between the two, you can see that in terms of the rationalist terminology, the stuff that you need in a curriculum for a teacher to know how to teach and what to teach, that it's much less than the sociocultural concerns. There's 63%, well, almost 64% more criticalism than rationalist pedagogy terms in the 2020 curriculum. And between the two curricula, we see a 413% increase in DEI terminology. So, did Ontario having a conservative back to basics government help? I was very interested in this question, and this one surprised me. So if we look at the McGuinty and Wynne liberals from 2003 to 2018 and what they were doing with the ministry compared to Doug Ford's progressive conservatives, and the study ended in 2022, of course, he's still in power, we can see that under the Ford's PCs, there's been an 83% increase in criticalism terms in both curriculum and pedagogy documents. So it appears that either nobody is tending the house, the ministers of education don't know what's going on in their bureaucracy, and the ed schools, the teachers' unions, and the teachers' colleges are just doing what they like, which is to compete with each other for this kind of, critical, we're going to overthrow society, even though they don't really need to overthrow society. This is just, what they discuss. Because, of course, if they overthrew society and they had a socialist utopia, they wouldn't be making six figures of salary. So that's where we're left. I'm just going to leave this contact information up for a second if you want to write down my email address, or you can get it from the organizers. It's sfreich@outlook.com. And I'm going to stop my share. That's my main presentation. And I wanted to give all of you lots of opportunity to ask questions, either about something I presented or about your own particular concerns about the education system.
Hi, everybody. So now we're going into the Q&A session with this, and the way we'll handle this is by asking you first to keep your mics muted so that no ambient sound comes in that's going to be different. We're going to use the chat box for your questions. If you have questions, please write them in the chat box, which I've just opened now. So it should be no problem getting those questions in. Depending on the number of questions, I'll occasionally combine a question on the same topic into one question, so that gives people more of a chance or just get to the topics. And this will allow Stephen to answer as many of your questions as possible. If we have time, we'll move to open mics at the end of the event. Let me just say, Stephen, that a lot of this is kind of shocking to a lot of people, right? I mean, when they listen to this carefully, they'll realize that the educational system we have today doesn't bear that much resemblance to what many people here have experienced when they were kids, right? That would be the pre-1970s kind of paradigm that a lot of people grew up with, right? And the people who are younger, I mean, people who are 25 would probably recognize a lot of these terms, right? So I'll leave the chat box open, but I do have a question for you, a couple of questions I've prepared in terms of the way this is working. So I think a lot of people would admit that a lot of what's happening in the school system now is indoctrination along critical race theory lines, right? And we know this. So what would you suggest in terms of minimizing that propaganda or that indoctrination and trying to bring back what I think a lot of people would think of as the kind of dispassionate content, just teaching content that teachers should be doing, right? And not the DEI stuff. So how would you bring that back into the school system? Or what's a first step for that?
Well, so, I think the first thing is if you're a parent or a grandparent, I think that, we're going to have to take the responsibility to talk to our school children and tell them that this stuff is not true, that this stuff, there's no truth to this. This is someone came up with this, and we can put it in context that, the critical theory comes, first of all, from Marxist theory, which then when, it crossed the ocean and came to America's shores, was taken up by Black and feminist scholarship. And, suddenly it wasn't about, the workers and worker conditions, but rather was transferred, maybe it's the Black people or women or gays who are the ones who are oppressed. And therefore, we're going to look at everything. We're going to, everything civilizational is terrible and oppressive. Nothing ever gets better. We have to help our children understand that the classical liberal model, is not perfect, but it's always improving. And that, the inclusion of women, even as early as, for women to vote, or for equal rights. And if you're, inclined this way for same-sex marriage, is a perfection of the classical liberal model to say, are there any reasons why we would exclude someone from these rights and responsibilities? Because the classical liberal model comes with both, that we have to think of both. So that's the number one thing, that you have to do a little bit of educating at home.
Right.
But in terms of advocacy, you have to go to the top. You have to go to the provincial governments any way you can, whether it's the premier, whether it's the minister of education. Get together as large groups as possible and advocate for change. And the change you want to advocate for is a classical liberal curriculum and science-based instructional methods.
Right. Yeah. There's that Marxist element that everybody tends to deny but knows is there, right?
It's
I think that,
absolutely there. I mean, if anyone who is honest and has looked at the literature, how the academics got to, why is critical race theory in the classroom?
yeah, why?
Or, they call it culturally relevant pedagogy. Well, because they're in American schools where you had Black teachers in lower income Black classrooms, where, the kids were not doing well, where there was lots of behavioral problems. These teachers came up with the idea, well, you know what? We could like make the outcomes the same so that these kids get A's if we just make the curriculum about what they're interested in. So we can make it about rap, or we can make it about, and the first person who actually gave a name to this actually talked about that. Like, let's make rap the official curriculum. Like, forget about the English language canon. Like, let's do rap. And if you've got a bad a badly behaved boy in your class, well, let's make him the leader, and let's get him to lead the students, and they'll all do these things together. And then I'm not going to evaluate them. Let them do their own thing, whatever it is that they want to do, and then they have to mark themselves, and then everyone gets the same mark. Because remember, equity is not about equal access. It's about everyone coming out with the same outcome. And you can't do that. I mean, you can try,
Yeah.
with Marxism. Communism certainly tried that, but we know it's just not human nature. Like, we do, not everything is socially constructed. We do come with our bodies and our biology,
Yeah.
and we come with different levels of talent, and behavior and personality and smarts and et cetera, that influence those things.
Yeah, a good summation, I think. So I've got some questions from the people who
Sure.
came in the chat box. So Richard says, education as ideological indoctrination is an attack on Western culture, history, knowledge. I agree with that, by the way. The family and so on. Arguably, we can say this is happening in parallel institutions, the ideological state apparatuses. And he mentioned someone called Althusser here, such as the church, the police, the civil service, and so on. How do we even begin to counter such a society-wide transformation? Before you answer that, I just heard the other day that, and I think the Waterloo School District, they declared the family as a white form of white supremacy. That was a
Yes.
but anyway, back to Richard's original question: how do we even begin to counter such a society-wide transformation?
So I think that the Canadian way tends to be that we don't want to have conflict, and we don't want to make waves. So we'll be quiet, we'll just sort of nod our heads. No one wants to be called a racist or sexist or a homophobe or anti-trans or whatever. So we just keep quiet. We have to learn to be brave, and we have to learn to tolerate some amount of conflict. Now, by that I mean that we have to argue from liberal principles. We have to say, I'm very sorry, Canada is one of the best countries in the world. We are part of the civilized West. The West has, no one wants to immigrate to the Central African Republic. They want to immigrate to Western countries. And the reason is because, first of all, classical liberalism doesn't care what you look like, doesn't care what your background culture is, doesn't care what your religion is, as long as publicly you speak the language of the nation, you are responsible to the nation, and you behave in a way that allows society to flourish. That's it, right? There's no other. Now, lots of other places are not like that. You have to share their religion, or you have to act in certain ways, or you're not allowed to speak your mind, or you're not allowed to work in certain areas, or research certain things. So we have to be willing to say, this is a silly, because it is silly, a silly attack on civilization. And let's be honest, right? If you get a cancer diagnosis, do you want the latest developments in Western medicine to treat you? Or do you want some folk medicine from some indigenous group wherever in the world, to do their rituals on you? Or would you like to live in a society where you didn't have a choice between the two, where you were, oh, well, today you're getting Dr. So and so, who's the best oncologist, but tomorrow, whoever shows up, you're getting this elder who's going to, smudge you and use herbs from that their grandmother told them about. And I'm not just talking about Canada's First Nations, and I don't mean to be facetious about their, the various cultures and traditions. Those cultures and traditions exist everywhere, even across Europe. The folk traditions, like wrapping yourself in mustard and putting a blanket around yourself to get rid of a fever. I mean, there is a classic Eastern European cultural tradition. But the thing is, they're all folk tales, right? They have nothing to do with science. They've never been proved. We have to say that the only way that we're going to have a healthy and resilient and developing society is to embrace classical liberalism, scientific principles, and otherwise to leave people alone to believe what they want to believe. And that includes for people that are religious, right? Let's not get in people's faces. We don't have to make everyone secular. I'm secular, but I have friends who are religious Roman Catholics or religious Jews or whatever. Let do we need to stick their face in something, or can we have a public education system that respects everybody?
Yeah, good answer, I think. And Mike has a question here. Do you think parents generally are aware of the radical shift that has taken place since they were in school? And that brings up the topic of SOGI, the LGBTQ plus 2A sort of thing that's been shoved in the kids' faces, and the current I don't know, conflict about sexual content in kids' books and libraries and so on and so forth. So do you think that they're aware of that? And do you think their awareness of this reality is critical to bringing about the needed changes to education overall?
Well, I think that, my general impression, I haven't done any research on this, but, just from being a human being and being a parent, having had a kid in the public system, is that most parents just care that their kids get their A's or A pluses so they can get the credentials so that then they can, get further credentials in university and, and hopefully have the same lifestyle that their parents have. So I would say that for the parents whose kids, they don't get calls from the school, their kids aren't struggling, the parents aren't noticing anything, they probably don't know. And they will say they don't care. They think their kid's getting a good education because the report card is full of A pluses.
Right.
I think that the people that are first going to notice are the parents whose kids are struggling because they're not learning, and that's a large percentage of kids, or kids that now express confusion because the way that they understand the world. And remember, developmentally, children are pretty concrete, especially young children. So for children to come home and be very confused about I am this, I know that I'm this, but now my teacher's telling me I'm not, or that I could be whatever I want, or that people can just change their sex. That's the kind of thing where parents suddenly go, wait a second, what's going on? So I think that there has to be an education effort from groups that are concerned to let parents know, show them the results of, and people are doing this. Some of the materials that are being introduced by teachers in class. Remember, teachers have a lot of autonomy. They close the door. They can kind of do what they want. We've seen examples of BC teachers that their classroom looks like, a rainbow vomited in the classroom.
Yeah.
And, and they're worried about, trans stuff and everyone assuming an identity, and they don't seem to be interested in knowledge. And that's the purpose of school. They've lost the script. So I think that there has to be education around that. And then I think parents have to say no. and say no both in terms of withdrawing their kids from those lessons and also saying no in terms of saying to their kids, for example, you were a boy, you're a boy, you have a penis and testicles. You can't change that. That is all, that's what you've got. When the kid gets older, you might be able to say to them, look, people can have surgeries and take, hormones that will make them appear perhaps a little bit like the opposite sex. They come with a lot of complications, lifelong complications that you have to live with. They're irreversible. um, you know, if your teacher is telling you otherwise, then your teacher is an idiot. And there's nothing wrong with telling your kid that their teacher's an idiot.
Yeah, that's
When my son understood that many of his teachers in public school were idiots, and they weren't idiots because they were malicious or whatever, they went along with this, and somehow they left their thinking cap at home, because sometimes I would have conversations with them and they would say, I know, I wish I could just teach, you know, Shakespeare or, but the school won't buy the books. Instead, they bought this book on, on gender identity, for example, if we're
yeah.
talking about Soji. And this is what I have. That's all I have, whatever. So but then the kid has to know this is not an education. Like, go to school, hang out with your friends, whatever. The fact is, your marks don't really matter till grade 12 anyway. Schools won't fail you. So, be that parent, be that grandparent that introduces your kid to an atlas, that, buys your kid, classic books to read and discuss them with them. Right now, that's the only thing you can do. Otherwise, your kids are not going to be educated.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned, because it's leading into some of the questions that are coming up right now about alternate systems, right? And I know that in Eastern Europe, a lot of parents taught their children privately and just basically told them, "Oh, this is what the state's telling you, but this is what I'm telling you about Poland's history, or about our faith or whatever." They had to do it underground, and
Yeah.
and that was a long struggle for a very long time. And so I'm going to get to one of the questions that people have here, a great guy called Rick Higgins. But I just wanted to mention that Bruce Pardy, a Queen's University law professor, one of the leading figures in the Free Speech Union of Canada now, has advocated for something called the parallel polis. In other words, the separate city. In other words, separate systems of education in opposition to the broken institutions we have now. So is that the stage we're at? That's the question we want to ask ourselves, right? And then that dovetails in with what Rick has got to say here, which is, would you say that homeschooling is currently preferential on a purely educational basis to the provincial education system? So he says he has Christian friends who taught their children at home, and their children have gotten great jobs, are intelligent and articulate, right? But a lot of that is homeschooling. And so is that the future of education, or are separate systems the future of education as opposed to the public school system, which I worked in 28 years, and by the time I retired was virtually not, useless. But
So let me address Bruce Party first. Bruce and I have had some great conversations about, he's a real libertarian and operates on principles. I'm more of a pragmatist, and I'm always interested in sort of the unintended consequences of enacting one's principles. But Bruce would go as far as saying that the government shouldn't be paying for education at all, and we should just leave it to individuals, and individuals would do what they want. And even when I said to him, well, what about, the kid in social housing with a single parent who's working three jobs, put food on the table, he went, those are the kind of parents that will educate their kids at home, or, will find some way to get their kids an education. And he said, for the kids who are not motivated, who come from homes where the parents don't care, whether they go to public school or whether they don't go to school at all, they're not getting an education anyway. So what does it matter?
yeah,
He's got, there's a point to that, and he gives a wry smile because he's sort of won the principled argument. But that's not kind of where I lie. I would say this. I think that one of the problems that Canada has is we lack competition, and we lack competition in almost all areas, which means that the prices for things are way too high. That our services are, basically provided by duopolies, And so it is with the public education system. Without any competition, then they rule. And the bureaucrats who are captured by this ideology, they make all the decisions. So I applaud, I don't know tons about it, but I applaud, for example, a province like Alberta that is, has a charter school system saying, we're going to allow people to open up their own charter schools and run education the way that they want to.
Yeah.
And let there be a marketplace of ideas. Now, will every parent make the right decision? No, but that's true of parenting in general. So that's one option.
Yeah.
I mean, the other option that, ideally I would like to see, but how we get there, I don't know, unless you all have connections to ministers of education and I can meet with them, would be, pardon me, for the public education system to adopt, a classical curriculum and science-based techniques for pedagogy. But how likely is that to happen in our current atmosphere? I don't think so. So let's get to homeschooling. I think it's a great idea. I think that's the only way your kids are going to get a classical education. The other option is I did some research into the private school sector in Ontario, and I specifically was looking at up the 1,200 private schools in Ontario. How many were doing something different than the Ontario curriculum? Very few. So even the high-priced, elite academies, etc., they were doing exactly what Ontario's doing, just in fancier surroundings and for a lot of money. But which schools were doing things differently? The Christian academies, the odd Muslim school. There was one or two Muslim schools that also were following a classical curriculum. But it was mostly the Christian schools that were following a classical curriculum. All the other private schools were basically doing what public school does. And if you send your kids there, you're basically paying for the same education they get at public school. So
Okay.
I would say if you're Christian, you do have the option of Christian academies. If you're not, homeschool.
Okay. So we have a time factor here because we want to move to open mic and stuff, but I also have a couple of questions here. So if we could deal with them kind of briefly. On
Sure.
what basis, this is from Jesse Gronwald, on what basis would you say that classical liberalism will provide a good education? In other words, is the background assumption that there is a real truth and real good out there, and that humans freely studying and debating can get to them? It seems that part of the challenge is that families' parents are not necessarily convinced that this is the case. If not, what evidence can be used to turn towards such a worldview?
Great question. So, I think what drives classical liberalism, what has driven the development, not only in Western society, but remember that first of all, when we talk about Western society, it's a bit of a misnomer because we're really talking about the Eurasian continent. Because throughout history, the exchange of ideas, all the way from China, all the way through Asia to the ends of Europe, the Mediterranean basin, North Africa, that's what we're talking about. So, but okay, let's call it Western civilization, but for the criticalists out there that say, oh, Western civilization is white, nothing could be further from the truth. You've got a million different ethnic groups. But the point is that what drives it is the search for truth.
Yeah.
So it's not that classical liberalism says we now know the absolute truth. It says we always need to be getting closer to the truth, that we as these beings on earth with our five senses have to constantly be using our tools of observation, our senses, and then our minds and our brains. And the knowledge that comes before us, the discoveries, the arguments, the controversies that come before us to better understand the world. And that if we keep doing that, we're going to get closer and closer to the truth. We may never get to the truth because of our limitations as human beings, but that has to be the drive. Progressivism and criticalism say there is no truth. Everyone has their own individual truth. Well, then you just have anarchy. How can you have a functional society or a society where people feel a responsibility toward that society and their fellow human being if everyone has their own truth and my truth is right and your truth is wrong and that's the end of it?
Yeah, very, very, very good points. Okay, so now we're going to move to an open mic format. If people want to ask questions, could you use the hand icon at the bottom or top of the screen? Because if people are waving and stuff, I might miss it. Please don't really actually wave your hand, we might miss you. That's the way this technology works. So there's a couple of questions here that didn't get it to you, but I'll leave that for people, and or I'll connect with them so that you can answer them.
Sure.
So I'm seeing no hand icons at the moment.
Don't be shy, don't bite.
Yeah, don't be shy. Don't be shy. Um, so maybe we'll, since I am not seeing any at the present time, I'll go to a couple of questions here
Sure.
from what we had before. Um, Boudica says, have the student-teacher practicum assessments been influenced by the critical paradigm?
Yes, absolutely. Not just the critical paradigm, but the progressive paradigm. Let's say, I'll give you an example. At my institution, OISE, there's one course out of all the courses taught by one lone professor about the cognitive science of learning, where they actually teach you, how people learn, and from that, what are the techniques that people must use in order to make people learn. If you did that in the classroom, you'd get a negative assessment because the first thing you would do is arrange the desks in a row. Then you take down all the decorations in the front of the classroom and move them to the back wall so
Yeah, that's what I used to do.
students aren't distracted when the teacher is giving a lesson. And what is your assessment going to be? Oh, this is a sad place. We need to make this happy. It has to be like Disneyland,
It's
and the
chaos.
children should be in groups and facing each other and whatever.
Yeah.
So absolutely. Also, the idea that you're not going to stick kids in groups and ask them to discover their own knowledge or do their own learning.
Yeah.
That if you're being frontal, the teacher's directive. Now, I should say, direct instruction is not just the teacher talking at you. Direct instruction can include spelling bees, math, baseball, coming up to the board.
Yeah.
It can be, getting up out of your desk and doing it. But the point is, the teacher is running it, it's whole class, and the feedback is immediate. So the children are disabused of their misunderstandings immediately. That's direct instruction. You do that in the classroom, and your assessment is going to be you're not doing enough discovery and inquiry-based learning because that's what creates critical thinking, which is actually a complete myth.
Yeah, it's a complete myth. And we do have someone who would like to ask you a question, Edward.
Sure.
Okay.
Hi, Stephen, thank you for such an overview. It's amazing. I'm wondering what criticalism in a math class, how that would express itself.
Sure. So before I give you an actual example, the Ontario almost put into its 2020 curriculum a thing about how math is a product of whiteness and ethnocentrism, and that we must commit to decolonize mathematics and make it, less important, so that we recognize other ways of knowing, including indigenous ways of knowing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how that would look, for example, and there actually have been people that have sort of seized on that and created things called like ethnomathematics or mathematics with an X at the end, where you're supposed to take children outside so that they can see patterns in nature and then realize that the whole world is composed of patterns. And somehow that's going to replace mathematics, as if you're going to build a bridge or a hospital based on the patterns that you see in petals. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with, looking at that, whether I'm not sure, maybe not in a math class, but maybe in a nature class, maybe just as an activity, outdoor activity, or maybe an art. But I just don't see how that is going to be mathematics. So in terms of criticalism, a lot of it is going to be, talking about how various indigenous people, and they're not just talking again about First Nations, depending on the teacher, they might be talking about, maybe some African tribe, or some tribe in South America that had some conception of multiple numbers or numbers up to 20. I mean, it may be interesting. And if you were, in high school and doing an anthropology class or cultural studies or something like that, it would be very interesting. But again, it's not mathematics. Like, we want people that can build things and build your house so it doesn't fall down on you, or a bridge that's not going to collapse when you drive over it. They actually have to learn math. And math is not Eurocentric or European. It's global. It belongs to everybody. And many, many cultures historically have contributed to it, including China, India, and the Greeks and the Romans, and during the Muslim conquest, the North Africans, and then in modern times by mathematicians all over the world in every single continent. So it's ridiculous to say that this only belongs to Europe or only belongs to white people, but that's the kind of thing that they'll do. Now, progressives will do something else. What they'll say is, oh, we're going to give you a word problem, hopefully around social justice things, and then go figure it out. Figure out there's no one way to solve it. There's no one way to multiply or divide. Come up with your own way and make a poster about it and whatever. So listen, it's okay, but you've got limited time, right? And you want to make sure that by the end of the school year, the kids all know their multiplication tables to 12. They can do it in their head, that they can do log division. If you leave this to them, well, then you're taking up time that is better spent on actually learning stuff. And plus, except for the rare kid, most kids are going to tune out. They're going to be bored and they're not going to want to do these projects. So that's what it looks like in the math class.
Mike has the next question. So go ahead, Mike.
There we go. Stephen, just wanted to ask a question, something we talked about earlier about how do we get from where we are to a better place? Like, how do we move education from what is really now propaganda and indoctrination in a particular worldview? How do we get it from there? Even if it's like a starting point, or what do we do to kind of move ourselves away from this sort of death sentence that we've given ourselves?
Well, one thing that I would do, there's a wonderful organization that started in the UK, and now there's a Canadian chapter called Research Ed. So research and then ED. And they produce materials and videos and papers about cognitive science-based techniques for learning. Speak to the teachers, speak to principals that you know, speak to anyone in education, recommend to them that they go to the next Research Ed conference, that they go to the website, that they, start learning about better ways. Even if you have to convince them that the best way, because one of the wonderful things about cognitive science is it doesn't care if you're rich or poor, or it doesn't care, what kind of family structure you come from. These are structured so that we start with the assumption that the children know nothing. So we start from the very beginning, and we make sure that the children, go through a staged, slow climb through the curriculum as it gets more and more complicated. That's what this research is saying. This organization now is out there in Canada. They have podcasts, they have materials. I encourage you all to go and look at it. And, start there. Everyone that you know, speak to them. And then in addition to that, what I was talking about, speak to other parents, talk about that to them. Think about, homeschooling units where, a collection of parents, can read up on this, can decide on a classical liberal curriculum. There's stuff out there. E.D. Hirsch, who is American, who talks about a core curriculum, which is really a classical liberal curriculum for the United States. I mean, you could adapt it for Canada. You add in Canadian materials, you take out some of the American history and substitute Canadian history. It can be done. But we have to start having these brave conversations and saying to people who want to, push this progressivism, this criticalism, no. And it's not because I'm a racist or, whatever you're going to call me. Those are just names or whatever. It's because I actually care about children and I care about education. And that requires that we front knowledge in front, not your revolutionary ideas or fads, but knowledge.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And Rick has a question next.
Great presentation, Stephen. Thank you very much. Think I've had a bath in intelligence. Would you, in your opinion, is education as we know it today, will it have a functional role in the AI world coming up, or it be something that's just arcane? That was then, this is now, and you just be getting an education for personal benefit, not for occupational.
Excellent question. So here's kind of where I lie on this. I think that AI, the function of AI is to take thinking out of your brain. It's going to basically make humans unnecessary. So if we look at it just in terms of, product, you want to have that paper done, you want to have that job done, you want to have that marketing done. Most of the white collar jobs are going to disappear to AI. So, looking at education as just, what you have to do, the credentials you get in order to get a job is the wrong way to look at education. We have to have a greater purpose as human beings, and therefore AI can't replace it and actually has no place in schools. Children should not need to do computers. Maybe in high school, when you start actually, writing essays and you're doing, online research. In elementary school, absolutely not, and no AI. And we can make sure that that doesn't happen by making sure that all the work at school takes place in school, in front of a teacher, without any electronics, phones, or computers. We need people to think, right? All AI is doing is sourcing past knowledge that is on the internet, right? It's not going to come up with new knowledge. So that's the purpose of human beings. If we just want to stop right here and say, okay, we've had a good run, but that's the end of humanity. We're going to birth the next species, which is going to, escape the Earth and live in the universe. Then I guess we can rely on AI. But if we want to have a purpose greater than that, and we want to continue to think, then AI doesn't have any place in education.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thanks. Okay, we're at about 8:10. So I think it's time for Mike to take over from me and be spotlit.
Oh,
You okay?
I just disappeared.
We can see you, or I can
hear
see
me?
you at least.
Yeah.
Can you see me? Okay,
Yeah.
then I won't even worry about what's happening next. Stephen, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation, lots of thought-provoking information, and we really appreciate your expertise and your sharing it with us this evening. So thank you so much for joining us. And I would like to also thank our attendees for coming and just encourage them with a couple of actions before we close. First of all, I would encourage attendees to subscribe to our Substack, so that way we know that you are engaged with us there. And we also want to welcome and value your comments on our posts, so please do that as well. We would appreciate that very much. So from the board at FDC, we want to thank you all for joining us for this summer presentation. And again, thanks, Stephen, and thanks each one of you for coming. We want to bid you all a good night.